It's a wonderful opportunity to be here with our sister fund from Memphis, and I also want to recognize Michelle Lazumba, who's the CEO of the Women's Funding Network, which is the membership organization of women's funds, both nationally and globally, and all of you. It's wonderful to be on this panel. You know, at Washington Area Women's Foundation, we start with the fundamental belief, which we heard in the earlier plenaries, that when you invest in women and girls, they will invest in their families, in their communities, and transform our region and the country and the world. And so we have a huge vision here in the DC metro area. We want to see this become a region without poverty. And I know that's a huge vision, and it's going to take a lot of people to be a part of it. And we believe that a key part of that strategy to address it is to invest in women and girls and give them the opportunities and the resources that they need to thrive. And so we, like many of the women's funds across the country and across the world, play really central key roles in working on solving these seemingly intractable problems in our communities. And it's because we're at the heart of the community, we are trusted partners, we are conveners, and we put mission and community first. And that's really where it all comes from. And we add value by bringing this very concrete focus on women and girls. We're often the only funder in our respective locations and regions that are coming at the work from that perspective. And so it's not only that we are putting resources and education and advocacy and research with that gender lens, but we're also educating others and influencing others to look at their work similarly. We often hear that that's actually a big value that our stakeholders see in our work, and we have great examples of having partnered with, for example, an organization like Goodwill. Goodwill is a huge organization compared to the Women's Fund in DC, and we partnered with them to fund workforce development and wraparound case management for low-income women coming through their job training programs. And through our partnership with them, they were able to see that kind of approach and the kind of approach that we were spurring them to use with the women coming through their job training program was actually something that they could translate to the rest of their workforce, who were predominantly women and predominantly low-income women. And they actually, the CEO of Goodwill of Greater Washington will say that our partnership with them changed the way they looked at how they managed their business and their work. And so as the only women's fund in this region, we feel a particular sense of urgency around the issue of poverty because you know, we have the ability to affect both local and national conversations by virtue of where we are. And we also believe that being in the nation's capital, we should be a model. And unfortunately, I don't think we are. And that's what we strive to be. We have hundreds of thousands of women and girls in this region living right on the edge or in poverty, struggling to make ends meet every day, barely making enough to put food on the table, and if they get a little raise, then suddenly not qualifying for assistance that throws them, you know, on the other side of poverty. And we call it being one paycheck from disaster. And that is a reality for so many women in our region and growing in numbers every day. In 2010, we had more than 200,000 women and girls in this region living in poverty. That was 14% more than the year before that. And the District of Columbia has a female poverty rate of 21% in the nation's capital. It's an embarrassment. I'm embarrassed to share those statistics, that so much of our population here in the nation's capital is so vulnerable. And we should be a role model, and we're not. So our vision is to change that. And we want the DC metro region to be an area where every woman and girl is on a path to prosperity. We want to eliminate poverty, but we know that there's no world in which the Women's Foundation on our own can do that. That it's really going to take the entire community coming together. And so it goes back to what Ruby said about mobilizing our community. And that's, you know, policymakers, it's funders, it's individuals, it's nonprofits, to really start coming around a common vision of what we want for our community and the role that each of us can play. And so, you know, a big part of our role is making grants, and we make grants to organizations in a very strategic way based on needs that we've identified through research in partnership with large research institutions in the region, looking at programs that are having the measurable outcomes and the biggest outcomes possible on the lives of women and girls, and that can have lasting change. But we also know that that's not the only way to solve this. We have to invest in research, we have to invest in education, and we have to invest in advocacy and galvanize women's voices in the region and policymakers along the lines of some of the things we heard this morning. I want to talk about a couple of examples of partnerships. I've mentioned one. In order to get this work done, we are going to continue to find ways to partner across sector lines in our region. We have some great examples of funders collaboratives where funders are coming together and getting out of their silos so that we can together make impact, for example, on early care and education as a community rather than as the Women's Foundation and then the K-Fritz Foundation. But I want to talk about a couple of national collaborations that I think have the potential to be models for greater impact. Most women funds, Global Fund for Women is more international and national and broader in scope, but many of us are operating regionally or in a city like Memphis. And so you would think, as Ruby said, how can we have national impact? Well, I believe we can. Number one, by trying out things on the ground in our communities and showing that they work and then being able to demonstrate that they can be scaled. That's number one. Number two, we have strength in our numbers, and Ruby and the Memphis Women's Fund and us and several other women's funds across the country have found ways to collaborate across state lines to expand our voice, expand our presence, and act at a national level. So one is the Women's Economic Security Campaign, which actually pre-existed my tenure but has now morphed into a phase 2. And that's a collaboration of 4 women's funds, Memphis, Washington, Chicago, and California, who started off in a collaboration working with Ford Foundation funding to put together policy briefs around issues relating to women's economic security that were then shared widely both within our networks and without. And it was a way to move this conversation about women's economic security beyond our regions and show the collective effort. That collaboration has now morphed where that same group is taking on developing case studies on what has worked and what hasn't worked in our workforce development work so that we can share both locally and nationally. Here are great strategies to putting women on a path to economic security through workforce development pathways. And here are some things that we tried that didn't work, because we still hear a lot about them, but we want you to know why we've moved away from these kinds of investments. And I think the third phase of this collaboration will actually be a national advocacy campaign, and we're already talking about how we can then turn this collaboration into identifying issues that related to workforce development, policy issues that we can tackle from the ground up, but that can then be tackled from the national level down. So things that we can collaborate on regionally that then can have a national impact. So that's one, and I think there's so many opportunities to do that, and there's a power in numbers in terms of the women's funds across this country where we talk about ourselves as being a movement, but we really can be a movement. The other I want to talk about is yet to be announced, but it's in development, and going to your issue about resources. A lot of us we're all struggling to raise the resources that we need to raise to do our work. We talk about going after the same funders, and especially as regional or local entities, it's sometimes hard to attract the national funding. It used to be easier with national foundations. That has changed with the economy. But with national corporations, it's been very difficult to get that kind of reach and get that kind of focus. And so we've started over the past several years, and there's one that's coming up, of coming together to talk about how can we act locally to create national change and bring a national funder to fund multiple women's funds working on very similar issues. It doesn't have to be exactly the same issues, but women's economic empowerment issues so that we can have a national impact. And the beauty of it is it's attracting funders that we in Washington might not have been able to get by operating on our own, or if we had, it would have been a smaller amount. But by pulling together funds that are working on similar issues, we can have a much bigger impact. It attracts bigger dollars, and it's a bigger story, and gives us the opportunity to advocate on the value of women's funds. And so I think that this is another great example of collaboration that I hope we're going to see more of. I think You know, I certainly, in my conversations with national funders, am using that as an example of why it makes sense to invest in us, and look what's happening on the ground and the effect you can have nationally. So just to close, I want to say, you know, we've talked a lot at our foundation and with our board that to have real meaningful change, as opposed to incremental small change, we have to think really big, we have to act really big, and we have to get out of our silos and figure out how to partner in new and innovative ways. And that's really the only way that we are going to even begin to solve the challenges that our communities, our regions, the country is facing. So thank you.
Thanks, Nikki. Shelley? Well, that's a great segue.